I thought I had 30 minutes, so I'm going to have to really hurry up. Okay, great. So, thank you very much indeed, Gail, for the introduction. I think it's just worth, since Gail hasn't done it, I just want to say a couple of things about why I'm sort of standing here, I suppose. And it is true that I've done lots of different things in my life. One of them was running the Williams Formula One team for 5 years. So I was looking at the background there. And that's a CFD image from our aerodynamic development program back in those days. And I think the reason I've chosen that image to set things off and to frame this discussion is because what you notice about those airflows is that they're a mess. And in fact, they're massively oversimplified. As we learn to our cost, CFD is still not able to replicate what happens in the real world that accurately. And that's really kind of a bit of a theme today. So I've called this discussion sort of technology versus strategy, because pretty much everyone here is involved in technology in one way or another, but I would argue also in strategy. My own experience in that field, and I'll just very briefly, is running a Formula One team was a kind of crash course in strategy, and we'll come back to that in a minute. I've also run a charity, big businesses. I do venture capital. I've even been a barrister. I've been in the Court of Appeal nearby here. So strategy has been very much a part of my career, and it's something I've thought about and I've studied. I've done a PhD at UCL on it a couple of years back. So that's why I'm standing here, is because I really want to share some of the things that I've studied and learned and experienced with you, because I think it might be relevant to what many of you, probably all of you, are trying to achieve. So, assuming I can control this, let's go. No, I can't control it. So I'm pressing next. Technology always screws you, right? It doesn't matter how well organized things are. Right, so the word strategy is one that every single person in this room has used. It may well be something that's formally part of your job title, and it's something that we hear every single day. NHS strategies, Brexit strategies, whatever. It's a word that's used all the time. It's a word that's relatively new in our language. It dates back to the end of the Enlightenment, about 1770, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It really got a kicker, as you can see, two little bumps around the First and Second World Wars, and then with everyone demobilizing and going back into business, suddenly strategy became a business word, and then it's gone crazy, overtaken only by technology, as you can see. So a very important word. However, as that study found, it is one that is very little understood, paradoxically. And I would argue that strategy is a paradox. So, let's wake everybody up. Strategy is, finish the sentence, please, in your own mind, and I'm going to point somebody out in a moment and ask them to give me the rest of that sentence. Strategy is... Right, let's go. Strategy is a menu. Was that you, Richard? Thank you. Strategy is a menu. Can I have another word, another definition, keyword, anything you like? Someone over here. Strategy is a plan. Sorry? Organization. Direction. Roadmap. A way forward. Okay, so we have some very good suggestions. Noticeably, they're all different. All right? I was talking to a British civil servant the other day who said, it took me 2 years to understand what my boss meant by strategy. Right? And actually, that's not a stupid comment, and it's not an unusual situation. Well, let's have a strategy for this organization. Well, what do we mean by that? And to some extent, I'll be telling you what I think it is not. Now, that research study I cited in the last slide by Rhonda Pupo et al. Found there were 91 definitions of strategy, distinctive definitions of strategy, between about 1960 and 2005 or so. 91 different ones. So it's not surprising that we all have different ones. So here's two kind of important ones. The first one is Chandler's definition from the very beginnings of this subject. Strategy can be defined as the determination of the basic long-term goals and objectives of an enterprise and the adoption of courses of action and the allocation of resources necessary for carrying out these goals. So goals are very important in there. And then perhaps the most important one in the last few years, the Department of Defense, the US Department of Defense, a prudent idea or set of ideas for employing the instruments of national power. Now, what's interesting about those two things, those two definitions, is that the first one implies that strategy is a process, but it doesn't say it's a process. All right? So it's not just coming up with an idea. Notice that the second one is an idea. That's really telling that the US Department of Defense, with its tremendous record of success in Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., which we share in, thinks that strategy is about having an idea. Let's go and invade somewhere, or let's change the regime somewhere. That's a really good idea. Unfortunately, that isn't strategy. And I think there is a fundamental flaw in that definition as a result. Now, what do I think strategy is? So I like a gentleman called Steven Pinker. And he defines intelligence, as you can read up there. He says, if we are intelligent, then we must have goals. Intelligence, then, is the ability to attain goals in the face of obstacles by means of decisions based on rational rules. So the important thing there, which he's introduced, which was not in either Chandler's definition or the US definition, is obstacles. Strategy would be very, very simple if there weren't obstacles. So in my career, if there wasn't a gentleman called Bernie Ecclestone in Formula One, I would have had a lot more success. And if you'd actually taken out the other teams as well, I think I could have absolutely nailed it. Unfortunately, there were obstacles, big and small. So I say strategy is the process whereby we overcome obstacles in order to achieve our goals. And I think that everyone in this room has goals and faces obstacles. And that is the nub of it. It's a process to deal with those things. Now, just very briefly, there will be a bit of history here because I'm kind of fascinated by it. The word strategy appeared in modern languages apart from Greek in 1770, and it was a Frenchman who coined the expression. He was a classicist, so he took it from the Greek. But interestingly, he had just read the first European translation of the Sun Tzu, the Chinese classic on strategy. And it's quite interesting that at that moment, when he was trying to come up with this concept, he brought together the Chinese and the European traditions. And I don't think the timing is a coincidence either. This was on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, the eve of the French Revolution, American Revolution, the Revolutionary era, and it was in the wake of the kind of growth of the scientific method, which so many of you trade on every day. We all do. So let's go back another 2,000 years. The two most important texts, I believe, on strategy are the first two. One of them was written down in China during about between 500 and 300 BCE. And it's attributed to a man called Sun, known as Master Sun or Sun Tzu. And he is alleged to have said, strategy is of vital importance to the state. It is a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or to ruin. Hence, it is a subject of inquiry which can on no account be neglected. So he said the first thing is you have to study it if you're serious, right? And interestingly, there is not one politician that I'm aware of in this country who's ever studied strategy. They go to Oxford and they study PE, but they don't study anything that matters. Actually, on that subject, I often talk about, I especially like to go to business schools and talk about failure, because I have had lots of really quite material failures in my career. But I realized about 2 years ago, in about June 2 years ago, that I really didn't have a monopoly on this subject anymore, because I went to Eton, and my year was 1983. And the year above me was a gentleman called Boris Johnson. And the year below me was a gentleman called David Cameron. And I reckon they've kind of cornered the market in failure, although I think I'm slightly readier to acknowledge that than they are. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And then Socrates, everyone knows about Socrates through the dialogues written down by Plato. But Xenophon, who was another student of Socrates, wrote down some other dialogues in which there's actually a very interesting discussion about strategy. And in that, Xenophon quotes Socrates saying that in the dangerous times of war, the whole state is in the leader's hands. Great good can come from his success, great evil from his failure. Therefore, anyone who exerts himself to gain the votes because they were elected into these positions, but neglects to learn the business, deserves punishment. Hear, hear. So, two very much common thoughts about the same time during the beginnings of human history, 2,500 years ago. Here's a bit of Greek. So if you boil down what Socrates said, there's not a great surprise. Socrates said, or Xenophon said, by these reflections on what constitutes a good leader, Socrates stripped away all other virtues and left just the power to make his followers happy. And I think that's quite relevant for this group because Socrates would have got the safety message. He would have said, keeping the people who follow you safe is your first responsibility as a political leader, as a strategos, a general. Whatever your responsibility is, if you lead people, their safety is your first priority, is your priority. And I think it's interesting that the Greek perspective, which has so influenced our way of thinking about ethics, etc., is dominated by that one concept. If you, as a leader, set out to make your followers happy, then you're on the right track. And strategy, according to Socrates, is how you do that. And then Sun Tzu, very, very famous saying, if you know the other and you know yourself, in 100 battles, there is no danger. And that is where we come back to Boris and David, because Boris and David made the same mistake, right? Boris never thought he would win, and David never thought he would lose, right? But actually, if you think about it, that's the same mistake. It's not knowing yourself and not knowing the others. The people who voted for Donald Trump, the people who voted for Brexit, were completely misunderstood by the other side. And that has severe consequences. Maybe some people think those are very good consequences. Many will think not. But that's not the point. The point is, if you know yourself and you really know the people, the others, then you have a much better chance. Now, Francis Bacon, my absolute hero. Nearly 400 years ago, in 1620, he wrote the Novum Organon, the new instrument, which sets out what we now know as the scientific method. He called it the great renewal of science after a dark age of medieval sort of logic, scholastic logic, which said everything that you need to know about the world can be derived from the scriptures, etc. He said, no, we have to look at the world with fresh eyes, and we have to observe it, experiment with it, come up with ideas, share them, let them be challenged. And he said, if we do that, the progress we will make will be mind-blowing. He didn't use the word mind-blowing, but he was right. Why do I bring this up here? Because I think what's really interesting about this passage, apart from it is one of the most beautiful pieces of writing in the English language, is that Bacon is talking about the way the mind works. Remember our definition of strategy. We relate it to intelligence, the ability to overcome obstacles. That's what he's talking about. But interestingly, he says the human intellect is the source of its own problems. Think of cognitive biases that we all encounter all the time. He says the first ideas we have prejudice our thinking and distort the way we see the world. Then he talks about the human reason being like a palace without foundation, because there was no experimental experience or knowledge or observation underneath our theories of the world at that time. And we have to have a renewal of the sciences and arts and all of human learnings, beginning from the correct foundations, i.e. observation. And finally, he says, we have to look at the world itself, the nature of things, and the nature of the mind. And I think that's really important because many people here study the world You seek to manipulate the world, to change the world, to improve the world. But I don't think science and technology invite us to think about ourselves and how we think and how we behave, or even how other people think and behave. We're very focused on the sort of mechanical view of things. If you get that right, then things will necessarily follow. But unfortunately, that isn't the case. Now, the military world over 2,500 years has drawn some conclusions about strategy and what it is. And I want to share those in a couple of slides. So the first thing is this. Remember we mentioned obstacles. Now, I believe, based on the sort of military analysis, so the military analysis would say there are three types of obstacle. There's military. Does the other side have better kit than you do? Better trained soldiers, Air Force, etc. The second side, they would say, is economic. Do they have more money than you? And the third is political. Do they have the will to win? The will to fight on? Will they ever give up? Those three dimensions of the military world. Now let's translate them into our world. And we could say there's a technical dimension, an environmental dimension, and a human dimension. Now I had the pleasure yesterday of sitting next to somebody who is trying to redesign the way we use ceramics in electrical, batteries, etc. Now that individual, that young woman, if she wants to change the world, she's going to face three types of problem. The first one is technical. Can she develop solutions that are less damaging to the environment but achieve the same technical objectives? Does she have the technical ability? Does she have does the discipline itself have it, etc.? So that's a technical challenge for her. And that'll be the one that she's spending 99% of her time on. But the other side of it is environmental. Things like what budget does she have is made of, things that she can't really control. Budgets, the law, regulatory environment, are things allowed? Maybe things like the conditions of workers in the Congo. Things that are kind of out of her control. I call those environmental. And then thirdly, the human dimension. Even if you have a really good solution for something, it doesn't mean people are going to use it. There'll be other factors, people pushing back because they have business interests, for example, or they're lazy, and therefore they want to carry on using whatever they've got now or producing it. So there'll be a human dimension. Those are the three categories of obstacle that we encounter in life. And then there are also the three category of resource. So your technical capabilities, and those of people around you, your environmental resources, the labs that you work in, the LRF grants, the whatever else there is out there that can help you get the job done. The law, for example, the fact that if the law changes, that might help you to make change. And then human, people. How can people help you? Can we create a movement? Teamwork, etc., etc. So it so happens that the obstacles are the resources, and the resources are the obstacle. And every obstacle can be turned into a resource, and every resource can be turned into an obstacle. And they can change. You can have a colleague who's a friend and an ally who suddenly you fall out with, and they become your bitterest enemy. And they spend their entire life. Anyone who's done a PhD knows that this can happen, right? If your supervisor fell out with someone 6 generations ago, and that happened, they happen to be marking your, you're in trouble. So my point is, these things are dynamic. The other dimension which the military have worked out over a few centuries is what I call the vertical dimension, which is a kind of hierarchy. And this is really important. So the overall goal, and let's stick with our example of trying to change the way we use ceramics and batteries. What's our overall policy? Our policy is to protect the environment, to make the world more sustainable, right? Our strategy is how we're going to go about that, how we're going to weave it all together. Operational art is a concept that was developed in the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the First World War and the Russo-Japanese War. And it was when they realized that in a complex industrial world, it's very hard to turn tactical success into strategic success. So a small technical step forward doesn't necessarily turn into a strategic step forward. And that was basically observed from the First World War, where everybody made breakthroughs, but it didn't ever mean that you got much farther than 100 meters from your trenches. So the Russians invented this concept called operational art, which is how do you weave together a series of initiatives, a series of things that together create momentum. And just to give you one military example, imagine that in the First World War, people saw the front line as being a trench in Ypres and another trench in Ypres 100 meters apart. And they said, that's where the war is. The Soviets said, no, the war is Moscow to Berlin. The front line is a dot in the middle there. How do we move the momentum of the war from a siege of Stalingrad through to taking Berlin? And it's that sweep, that depth, that movement, that energy that they conceived, and they use it today. It wasn't until after the Vietnam War that the British and Americans cottoned onto this concept of the operational art. And tactics is kind of the lowest level of whether it's a negotiation or whatever, a transaction in that thing. And basically what the Soviets said is you weave tactical steps through operational art into strategic success. So for you need to think about, if you want to change the world, you need operational art, momentum, movement, etc. So when you put that together, you have our two dimensions. Bottom left is where the technical and the tactical are. That is where everyone focuses all their attention. All right? Top right is where you need to be, strategic and human. Right? If you want to change the world, look at someone like Donald Trump. On one level, you look at him as his technical understanding of stuff, his interest in it even, is kind of zero, right? How does he do it? Because he appeals up here at a very high level to a certain attribute of human nature that is just very, very powerful. I don't think he knows that he's doing it, but he does it incredibly well. All right? The point about this thing here is you can be really good at that stuff and you'll still lose. Napoleon lost. Hitler lost. Hitler lost one soldier for every 2 allies in the Second World War. After the Second World War, the Americans said, we need to study how the German army fight outnumbered and won. And someone said, they didn't win. And that's really important. They didn't win, but they were better militarily. So keep your mind top right, not bottom left. 2 examples. Let's start with the bottom left. I have to mention something about Formula One. We used to do refueling in Formula One, and when we were refueling a vehicle, we were limited to 12 liters per second. Right? That meant a pit stop at its very fastest was 6.5 seconds. When we got rid of refueling for the 2010 season, we started with pit stops that took 3.90 seconds. Okay, because we only had to change 4 wheels, and you can do that quite fast. All right? 2011, we got that down by a whole second. 2013, we got it down by another half a second. And in 2014, my old team, Williams, achieved 1.92 seconds consistently. So in that period, what's that, 3 to 4 years, Formula One was able to take 51% or 2 seconds out of a process that only took 3.9 seconds to start with. All right? And I always use that as an example of what is possible. When someone says you can't do that, you can't get along on this budget, or you can't do this, that is rubbish. Right? What is possible is beyond imagination. In 2010, we didn't know we could achieve 1.92 seconds, but we knew we could achieve better than 3.9. And so we just kept on going. Now, it is true that they have reached a limit now. But you only know when you've reached a limit when you've got 12 different teams trying to do the same thing, and they just can't, with all the creativity and all the sharing, because they see each other all the time. If they can't get beyond that, then you might accept that they've reached some sort of physical limit. But 99.99% of processes have not reached that point. So there's always hope. Does anybody know what this is? Has anyone seen this before? Yeah. So this is a very clever map done in the 19th century of Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia. And it's interesting because it shows the weather, the route, and most importantly, the size of his army. So the width of that, 1 millimeter on there is 10,000 men. And the gold band starts quite wide, and the black band, when he gets back to the border, is quite narrow, because he went from about 500,000 people to a few thousand. Now, the interesting thing about this, the reason I put this up is that we're talking top, bottom left, top right. This is a top right failure. Napoleon had the best soldiers in the world, right? And he had a lot of them. The reason he lost was that in 1812, when he invaded Russia, Russia was at war with Persia and the Ottoman Empire, and the Poles, and he had to go through Poland, and his wife was Polish, hated the Russians. But Napoleon thought that Alexander I was going to make peace with him, was never going to fight. So he didn't want to upset him and put him off. So he allowed the Russians to make peace with the Ottomans instead of lining up with the Ottomans. And he really annoyed the Poles, because the Poles wanted a promise of independence, and he refused to give it to them. So Napoleon completely destroyed any opportunity to have allies going into that war. He didn't take it seriously enough. And as a result of that, 500,000 of his soldiers lost their lives in what was the biggest campaign in history up until that point. Huge strategic failure. And it was a top right failure, not a bottom left failure. Very briefly, because I think this is interesting, the process of going from doing stuff really, really well to thinking about how you do it is being explored in the educational context as metacognition. And it's having transformational results on the performance of kids, especially more mature kids and kids with lower ability. All right? The ability to plan, and it's called learning to learn, thinking about learning, thinking about thinking. It's standing back, thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it. I just put that out. I'm not going to go into it in detail. But that process of metacognition is what we all need to do as a species if we want to survive the technologies that you've created. Because we're very good at cognition, we're very good at solving problems, but we're not very good at working out how we're going to do that in a way that actually is sustainable. So what's happening in education, I think, is very interesting. The Education Endowment Foundation, which is very near here, is a leader on this in the world. Now, instead of talking about metacognition, I want to leave you with one thought, which is, if you want to be better strategically, then what are you going to do? Well, obviously, you're going to do a few things that we've discussed. The first thing is you're going to start thinking of strategy as a process, not a plan. Not a plan, right? A plan is a plan. Strategy is a process of thinking and acting, reflecting, etc. It's metacognition. You're also going to use those two dimensions, I think, to just make sure you've got things in the right order, and you're thinking broadly about the obstacles and the resources available to you, and you're using everything available to you. The other thing I want you to think about is this, is what can you personally do? Now, some of you operate in very competitive environments. You know, academia can be very competitive, Formula One can be competitive. And one thing I've noticed is that a lot of the people I work with in all fields go into a room primarily with the mission of showing everyone else how clever they are. All right? And the problem with that is that if they are clever, it kind of intimidates people. And if they aren't clever, it's a bit stupid. All right? So what I've learned to try and do is this, is when you go into a room, always have the goal of making everyone else in that room feel better about themselves when they leave the room than when they came in. I know that doesn't sound like strategy, but actually, the most effective strategic person I've ever worked with was Ross Brawn in Formula One, who was brilliant. And that's what he always did. He always made you feel better about yourself, even when he was kicking your ass. All right? And I think that's a really important thing. So set yourself the goal, when you walk out of a room, people feel better about themselves. Okay? Not better about you. The second thing is listen. Listening is the most strategic thing that a human being can do. Right? People love being listened to. All right? But listening also gives the opportunity to know them and know yourself. All right? It's quite hard work, especially when you're standing up talking to people all the time. But it's quite hard to listen. But it's really important, and it's really powerful. I believe it's transformational. So I want to just double check before I sit down that I haven't missed anything really important. But I feel like those two things, you know, use the framework I've put forward if you think it's appealing. But listen, pay attention. And then maybe what you can do is combine your technology abilities. Many people in this room have incredible talent. If you can combine that with strategy, then I think you'll be even more powerful. So kind of my basic proposition is not strategy versus technology. It's kind of technology to the power of strategy. That's what I wish on all of you. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Adam. Unfortunately, you're not quite ready to sit down because we'll have a few questions.
Great.
And I'm going to use the chairperson's prerogative just to ask the first question, if you don't mind. Yesterday, one of the themes that seemed to be kind of underlying was mental health. And I noticed that in one of your early slides, you said one of the good leaders is to make your followers happy. Have you noticed mental health kind of creeping into kind of organisational strategy? I mean, I've seen it in the school sector, for instance,
Yes.
but have you seen it in the sort of other sectors that you've worked in terms of actually that being a larger part of kind of organisational happiness?
Well, I'm very privileged that one of the things I do is I'm an advisor to the chief executive of BHP Group, which is a big global resources company, and Andrew Mackenzie, who's their visionary chief executive, has done some amazing work on mental health within the organization and also diversity, interestingly. But I think it reflects his character as a leader, that he genuinely cares about these things. I'm very nervous about kind of ticking boxes and people who say we have a policy on X. What I would like to see, and I have seen in him, is leaders who actually do things that show they care. And I think that's the most important thing. I think you're not going to help anyone's mental health if you go through a kind of fake exercise. But if you genuinely care about people, that's probably the best thing you can do for them.
Perfect. So anyone else like to ask a question? We've got maybe 5-10 minutes. Yes? Thank you.
Hello, good morning, Adam. My name is Daniel Hiller from Germany, Fraunhofer, a research organization. A very practical question to you. And first of all, thank you for this very intriguing presentation. Let's imagine we have a company, an organization where the top right, let's say the CEO, follows a certain strategy, but somehow the bottom left soldiers on the ground either don't really understand what his or her strategy is or how he wants to achieve it. What's your very practical advice to the commanders in the middle, how they should act with respect to both the soldiers on the ground and the top right corner guy?
Thank you. Interesting question. Well, just to frame that, I mean, I think I would argue that that diagram shouldn't be seen as an organization chart. I don't believe that the supreme leader is top right and the troops are bottom left. I think every person, because we're all intelligent, should combine those areas. So I think the person on the shop floor or in the laboratory should be just as concerned with the overall objectives and vision of the organization as they are with the test tube that they're looking at. So it's not a model for an organization, it's a model for life that I put up there. So maybe that's part of the answer to you, which is I think that it's really good to have a strategic conversation in the organization. And I think one could invite the chief executive to enter into that discussion on the basis of saying, strategy isn't a document, it isn't even an idea, strategy is a process, why don't we talk about it? And then have people from different parts of the organization, different areas and different levels to have that conversation. I think a good leader should be very open to engaging with others in strategy. They shouldn't think it's their prerogative. I mean, that's exactly where we end up in the kind of messes that I mentioned once or twice here today. So see if you can open a conversation with your colleagues, with the CEO, to talk about it, and see if that's transformational. And tell him to listen, or her, I should say.
It reminds me of a Private Eye cartoon. I remember when Cameron was out jogging, and the headline was "Follow Me," and there was no one behind him.
Yeah, there's such an interesting story there. There's a bit of a side issue, but we have the Chinese have been studying government for 2,500 years and writing about it and how it works. Not politics, but government. And we don't have any tradition in the West of that. And if you look at this country, we don't even have a school of government. We used to have a school down in Ascot or somewhere, Sunningdale, where civil servants went on residentials. That's now online. And we don't have anything. Henry VIII, about 100 meters from here, in 1545, invited Sir Nicholas Bacon, who was Francis Bacon's father, and a couple of other barristers to come up with an idea for a school of government. It was going to be called the King's School, and they were going to have students who came in for 2 or 3 years to study government. And they would have guest speakers who had things that would benefit the Commonwealth, as they put it. And if Henry had a mission, sent a diplomatic mission abroad, some of the students would go along to learn. Unfortunately, we never did it, but maybe it's time. Sorry, next question.
No. Is there another question? Yes, just in the middle, please.
Good morning. Ranjiv Gunawardena, Chairman of International Consultants based in Geneva. You mentioned, well, the write-up here states something about venture capitalism. Could you explain your experience and the challenges that you have come across, and also possibly some of the successes that you might have had?
Well, where do I start? Look, my recent work has been doing spin-outs from the University of Oxford. So we have 4 spin-outs, 2 of which I'm very actively involved in, 2 of which I'm just a sort of founding investor. And then other companies, startups in Oxford and elsewhere. I think, honestly, this is the challenge, right? So generally speaking, if I'm doing a spin-out, we've got professors with amazing intellectual property, amazing experience and ideas. And the challenge is to meld that into a company, to make it work as a company. Because being an academic and doing research is not the same as running a business. The time frames are different, the pressures are different. When you're an academic, more or less you're responsible for getting money to fund your own research. Suddenly you've got a team of people you've got to feed. They have mortgages and so forth. So those kind of things. I think it's the human dimension of taking great ideas and then turning it into a product and then into a business. So, and I'm sure it's no different in your experience. It's that getting a team together and making it all happen. It's immensely challenging. It's always different. And it's really enjoyable. And I was saying again last night that if any of you are academics and you get the opportunity to do this down the line, it's not about the money. That's fun. But the opportunity to change the world, I think, through a business can be greater than just through doing research.
Have you got any vision on the Cambridge Analytica thing where Nick was the CEO, spun off a new company with partners in Russia, China, but was vilified in the press as soon as his name went on the new company letterhead? And a particular academic in Cambridge who started pure research that led to the secondary expansion of data harvesting.
Did everybody hear that question, by the way? So the question more or less was, do you have any views on Cambridge Analytica and the behaviour of the CEO?
What was a really good strategy,
Yeah.
a really good functioning company.
Hi, Dave Purcell. Have you any comments on CEO Nix is an old Etonian as well, I think. But Cambridge Analytica, the vilification of the Cambridge academic that started the way they analysed, the furtherance of the company with a great crowd of really good researchers, and then the vilification of a handy victim in the press, because obviously the end game was to support special forces, destabilising countries and everything else. What's gone wrong there? Because the fundamentals of the company are nothing to do with all that bad press and really good and accurate.
Well, I mean, so one of the businesses that I'm very proud of having be involved in was a company called Quantum Black, which was an early data analytics firm, and we founded that, and then it was bought by McKinsey a couple of years ago. So it's an area I'm very interested in, data analytics. I mean, I think we have to be really careful about what we do with people's data and their privacy. The ability to manipulate people, it turns out, is pretty phenomenal. And I'm not sure Cambridge Analytica, I think they were exploiting that, and that's how they made their money. Now, there are good companies that do that, and there are bad companies that do that. If we can do that for better health, better safety, great. If we use it just to make money and to encourage people to do things that they shouldn't really do, like eat more or, gamble. Yeah, I think the strategy is fundamentally, I mean, maybe very good in terms of very effective, but I'm not sure that they would subscribe to Socrates' kind of bottom line. The other thing, of course, is that the chief executive, who wants to guess which school the chief executive of Cambridge Analytica went to? Yeah, it's funny that, isn't it? All the bad people in history went to Eton. It's incredible.
Not all of them. Not all of them.
Well, you know what?
You went there.
I'm thinking of doing, I bumped into my old headmaster the other day, and I said, no, I'm going to do a book about this, because obviously Cameron and Boris, but the Prime Minister under George III, who lost the Americas, Lord North, guess where he went to school? Who's seen The Darkest Hour? Darkest Hour with, yeah? Yep. Well, Halifax, the guy who was trying to get rid of Churchill and wanted to basically make peace with Hitler, guess where he went to school? I mean, there's quite a long sort of history here. And I don't think it's a coincidence, because there's a certain type of education that gives you incredible confidence and incredible, very articulate, confident people, well-rounded, but not necessarily grounded in a set of values that they mean they do the right thing. So I do think that's important. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that was really interesting, and we could stay here all day talking, but sadly we have to move on because
Yes.
it's 10 past 10. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.